Hey guys, I'm Dimension Jumper. Today I'll be doing my top 5 favourite palaces from Persona 5 Royal. Now, with the palaces in Persona 5 as well as Persona 5 Royal, I feel like they're an interesting take on the dungeon format because they are each palace that you go across in the game are all representations of what's going inside each of the palace rulers' heads or their minds and what they perceive the world to be, whether that's Futaba's palace being a pyramid or Kamoshida's palace being a castle. Each palace is very unique in their design, and each one is very interesting to um, go across and try and it's interesting to like have a look around each palace and seeing how each palace is unique and different to one another. And also there will be spoilers up towards at the end of the game when it comes to some of the palaces that I'm going to be mentioning on this list. So for number 5 is Konoshiro's palace. Now his palace is basically a giant floating bank, and I would say this is quite an interesting palace because it kind of suits Konoshiro well, I would say, because he is a member of or the leader of this sort of gang who is trying to basically taking money away from high schoolers, and that his main base of operation or the area that his goons work at is in Central Street in Shibuya. And I do like this palace because you get to see how I think it's basically a giant floating bank, and you can see like what he thinks people are in terms of his cognition, that being just walking ATMs. And I do like how it's just basically a giant bank, and then towards the end of the palace, it's basically these you basically see these giant or these many safes, and when you go through towards the end of that, when you really go through that particular area, they form this sort of like key sort of thing in which if you type in the right password, then you'll see you get to open up a different or a new area that's towards the treasure, and that's really cool. And I do like how you can hear his sort of like inner thoughts about how he wants to get more money and be more powerful and stuff like that. And I think it's an interesting way to show it. And also his boss fight is kind of interesting because he transforms in because Konoshiro's palace or shadow transforms into a fly, and then he goes into a piggy bank, and then you later have to fight him like with your members. And he can also call in two henchmen flies, which I think is quite cool because one henchman fly is basically an attacker kind of character. The other one is kind of more of a defensive kind of character because if you try to hit Konoshiro directly, um, the defensive fly will protect him. And I do like how once he's run out of funds, because he does an attack where he'll just hit you with money, and as soon as he runs out of it, the flies just go away. And I think it's a really cool, interesting boss fight. And also, I do like how he kind of mentions the mysterious person in the black mask, which adds on to the plot going further on. For number 4 is Mayorame's palace. Now this is a cool looking palace because his palace is based on a museum, and I mainly like it how towards the end of the palace, again like with Konoshiro's palace, you have to try and find the real Sayuri, which I think is quite nice because you have to try and find because like even though you see the Sayuri like a couple of times before entering his palace and during the palace, you basically see these different pictures, and then you have to try and figure out, okay, this one's the real Sayuri, and there are other ones to um, distract you, but there are some like obvious fake Sayuris, and you have to be very precise because if you don't get the right one, I believe you'll be attacked by a shadow. And also the shadows in this particular palace are quite interesting in terms of the designs before you fight them, because they're all based on security guards, or like museum guards or stuff like that. And I think it's a really interesting way of them using the shadows in this particular palace. And I also like the some of the puzzles. Like, if you want to try and deactivate some lasers, you have to figure out what Madarame's foot size is. Do you think it's quite cool? And also for his boss fight, Madarame in Persona 5 Royal, he will first turn into a painting like he does in the original fight, but then he will curate. Once he's back in his human form, he will create duplicates of himself, and they all have different types, like fire, ice, wind, that kind of thing, and to use your attacks to try and hit the fakes and then hit the main Madarame. I think it's quite cool, and I think it's a very fun boss fight. For number 3 is Sai's Palace. Now, Sai's Palace, as well as the story that goes along with it, is quite unique because this is the palace before the big twist of the game, before you find out who the true culprit is and who ratted you out. When you learn about that at the start of the game, and with Sai's Palace being one of the later palaces, it's kind of interesting to see because this is an entire casino, and it's all based on the courtroom, I believe. Yeah, it's all based on the courtroom, and the casino is really interesting because this is a palace where Sai will always win, no matter the outcome. And I do like how if you want to try and reach the higher floors, you have to rig the games in your favor, or some of them in your favor. For instance, the very first game you do is a dice game, and then what you have to do is try and get like a high number or something, and you have to try and rig it in your favor. And you do like behind the scenes in a certain sense, like you have to defeat a shadow, and then turn the odds in your favor, which is quite cool. And then I do like how in there's different other ones. Like there's a game in which you have to try and go through an entire maze in the dark. There's one in which you have to try and do a casino, one of those the slot machine things. There's also one where you have to fight a bunch of shadows like one on one. But in this palace's case, it's after you beat a particular shadow, there are multiple ones after the next. Like I think it starts out with like 3, then 2, I believe, then 1, and then you'll get enough amount of money. And with Sai's Palace, or the palace boss, I do like how she uses a roulette table to try and balance in certain things, so like money, HP, SP, that kind of thing. And I do like how around the halfway point of the fight, the roulette table changes and to have different elemental attacks and stuff like that. So you've got like your fire skills, your ice skills, almighty skills, physical skills, that kind of thing. And I do like how you try and I believe try and hit Sai with either the elemental skill that she has or the opposite, or some of the skills that you have in your party. And I think it's really cool, and I really do like how this palace again leads up to the events in the present of the game, where you are telling Sai about all of the events that you did in the palaces before you got caught, which I think is quite cool. And then that leads into a whole hour of just cutscenes, and that's very, very long. For number 2 is Dr. Maruki's Palace. Now, with Maruki's Palace, I like it how it starts. It's basically this giant laboratory type palace, and it's basically I would say the most different out of the palaces in Persona 5 Royal, because this is the only palace where we don't see Maruki's shadow, but we actually see Dr. Maruki himself in the flesh, and we get to see how Maruki got himself a palace, and how we are ourselves, the character or the main player, basically helped Maruki develop or figure out about how to use the metaverse as a whole and try and help people. Because during Maruki's social link, you basically just talk about how how good it is to help people and stuff like that. And then when you finally when you go into the third semester, you find out Maruki has basically used his persona to try and basically just grant everyone's wishes and make them more happy. Like with, for instance, with your members of your team, like with Ryuji being on the track team, Haru and Futaba both having um, their loved ones being resurrected, with Haru being her dad and Futaba being her mum. And yeah, it's really interesting to see how different everyone's acting in this particular part of the game, because it just feels, even though it feels right, it feels wrong. And that what makes, I think, the one makes Maruki's Palace interesting, because like, again, like with the whole third semester and how reality is very different, you can see that this has the palace has two different things going on. For instance, during the like whole lot of towards from the start to the end of the palace, before you go into the final fight, the whole palace is sort of like this sort of like peace. It's like, it feels like heaven in a sense. But then when you get to fight Maruki in the first phase of this boss fight, it's rotten. Everything is rotten. Everything is like rotten and decayed, and you see his persona, like Azumarth, I believe that's the name of Maruki's persona, kind of this like giant golden persona thing with like these sort of like tentacle hand things that, again, like the boss arena around it, are rotten. They are decaying. And I also like how before you get to fight Maruki, um, on like the final day before, or the day before, you get to fight him. He kind of pleads with you, just basically saying that he just wants to help everyone, and try and just make everyone happy. And then that's where we're told about Akechi, but I won't spoil that. I'll leave that to you if you're playing Persona 5 Royal. And it almost feels like it's hurting, yeah, because like you're basically friends with this guy, and even though he's not evil, and he's just, I don't know, it just feels like something that, yeah, it just hurts in a sense. It just hurts to see you trying to fight this person who you kind of have the same ideals, in a sense that you both want to help society in a sense, but these two people are going in the completely separate opposite directions. Where with Dr. Maruki, he's basically just rewriting all of reality, and with the Phantom Thieves, it's just doing it yourself in that sort of sense, and they kind of talk about that towards the end of the game. And yes, it's a very fun, interesting boss fight. And for number one is Shido's Palace. Now, I find this palace to be fun because this is the guy who ruined your life at the start of the game, where we hear that Shido was the person who gave you a criminal record. And I do like how you meet him throughout several parts of the game, or you see him, depending on when Shido appears. Like the very first time you meet him is when you're given a criminal record. The second time you meet him in person is when, after your first successful palace or change of heart, that being with Kamoshida, and then you see him like on TV throughout different parts of the game, and then you meet him again towards the end, or during his when you're trying to get into his palace. And I think this is just really cool, where it's like, oh, I'm taking down the guy who gave me a criminal record, and he's like kind of like the, up to that point, the mastermind behind everything, which I think is quite cool. And I do like how his palace is just a giant ship, because that's basically saying that even though Japan will sink, Shido himself, along with a lot of his associates, will continue doing what they do, in a sense that they'll try and take down anyone that gets in their way, in a sense. And I do like how you basically have to try and go and find all these different people who have some way or some connections to the main plot, in the sense that you've got someone who was the Medjed who was like pretending to be Medjed during the whole during Futaba's palace. Then you've got the person who filmed Futaba, no, Haru's dad getting his change of heart or his mental collapse. And then you hear about Marurame, Konoshiro, how they've been giving money to Shido, which I think is quite cool because this all connects to because like each palace, in a sense, connects to Shido in a way, which I think is quite cool. And I do really like how you fight Akechi, in this palace because it's quite cool because it feels like you're really going all out with him because even though he seemed nice at first during the whole game, but up until that point you find out that he's the person doing all the mental shutdowns and the collapses and stuff like that, which like it's just this person that's just really hard to explain really. But with Shido's boss fight, I do like how for first the whole calling card. I think the calling card for Shido is probably the best one out of any of the other calling cards in the game. I also like how in the boss fight there are 3 phases, because the first phase is you fighting Shido on a lion. Then the lion gets wings. Then he becomes a giant pyramid, and then finally you fight Shido. And then during the second half of the Shido fight, final phase, you get to fight Shido. You get to fight Shido 1-on-1, which I think is quite cool because this feels like you yourself are taking down Shido himself, and it feels really interesting and cool just to take out the guy who ruined your life in the game. And then it's just really cool, and I think it's very interesting. And the boss room itself is kind of interesting because it's basically this giant auditorium area where people get to vote, I believe, in the palace or the courtroom. No, not the courtroom. Well, in the Dire building where people believe, where people get to vote on what goes through or not in terms of laws, I believe. Which I think is quite cool. And overall, I say Shido's palace is very fun and interesting. That's been my top 5 favourite palaces from Persona 5 Royal. I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.